The autumn wind swept across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood at the window of his private study, watching the last golden leaves fall from the ancient oak trees. It had been 18 months since his coronation, and the weight of the crown seemed heavier with each passing day. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had adorned these floors for generations. Charles adjusted his reading glasses and turned back to the mahogany desk where a stack of correspondence awaited his attention. Among the official documents and state papers lay a handwritten letter that had arrived the previous evening. The elegant script on cream-colored paper bore the distinctive seal of his wife, Queen Camilla. He had read it 3 times already, each reading bringing a deeper furrow to his brow. The letter spoke of concerns that had been weighing heavily on Camilla's mind for months. Her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, along with her grandchildren, seemed to be gradually distancing themselves from the royal circle. What had once been warm family gatherings had become formal, stilted affairs, if they occurred at all. The natural ease that had characterized their relationships before the coronation had somehow evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable protocol that left everyone feeling like strangers. Charles remembered the early days of their relationship, when the blended family dynamics had been one of their greatest sources of joy. Tom, with his culinary expertise and warm humor, had brought laughter to family dinners. Laura, artistic and thoughtful, had often engaged Charles in lengthy discussions about literature and history. The grandchildren had filled their homes with the kind of innocent chaos that reminded Charles of his own son's childhoods, before duty and protocol had claimed so much of their spontaneity. But now something had shifted. The transformation had been so gradual that Charles hadn't immediately recognized it for what it was. Phone calls became less frequent. Invitations to private family events were politely declined. When they did gather, conversations remained safely within the boundaries of weather, current events, and other neutral topics. The easy intimacy that had once defined their relationships seemed to have been carefully packed away, like delicate china stored for safekeeping. Camilla had tried to address the issue delicately in previous conversations, but Charles had been preoccupied with the demands of his new role. The transition from heir apparent to monarch had consumed his attention completely. Every day brought new challenges, from constitutional matters that required his immediate attention to diplomatic obligations that couldn't be postponed. The learning curve had been steep, even for someone who had been preparing for this role his entire life. The irony wasn't lost on him that in becoming King of England, he might be losing touch with his own family. The very position that was meant to represent the continuity of family traditions seemed to be creating barriers between him and the people he cared about most. Protocol, which had always been a part of his life, now seemed to govern every interaction, even the most personal ones. Charles walked to the fireplace where a small fire crackled, providing warmth against the October chill. Above the mantel hung a portrait of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, whose wise eyes seemed to follow him around the room. She had been masterful at maintaining family relationships while fulfilling her royal duties, somehow managing to be both a beloved grandmother and a respected member of the royal family. He thought about the last time all of Camilla's family had been together at Clarence House. It had been during the summer, a casual Sunday lunch that Camilla had organized with hopes of recapturing some of their former closeness. Charles had arrived late, having been detained by an urgent matter regarding Commonwealth relations. By the time he joined them in the garden, the conversation had already taken on that careful, measured quality that indicated everyone was being politely distant. Tom had been discussing his latest restaurant venture, but the animated passion that usually characterized his descriptions of food and cooking seemed muted. Laura had brought her children, but they sat quietly, clearly having been instructed on proper behavior for dining with the king. Even the youngest grandchild, who had once climbed freely onto Charles's lap during story time, maintained a respectful distance. Camilla had noticed, of course. Charles could see it in her eyes, the way she tried to bridge the gaps in conversation, the subtle hurt when her attempts at recreating their former ease fell flat. She had spent years carefully nurturing these relationships, creating a warm family environment that had provided Charles with something he had rarely experienced in his own childhood. Now, it seemed, the very success of their royal life was threatening to destroy what they had built together. The morning routine at the palace continued around him as Charles stood lost in thought. Footsteps echoed in the corridors as staff members went about their duties. The sound of voices carried from the courtyard below, where tourists gathered hoping for a glimpse of royal life. The machinery of monarchy moved forward with its usual precision, but Charles felt increasingly isolated at its center. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton entered, carrying a folder of documents that required the king's immediate attention. The morning briefing would cover everything from parliamentary business to upcoming state visits, each item demanding Charles's full concentration. The weight of constitutional responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as he prepared to immerse himself in the details of governance. But even as he listened to the briefings and signed the necessary documents, Charles's mind kept returning to Camilla's letter. The pain in her carefully chosen words was evident to anyone who knew her well. She had written about feeling caught between two worlds, loving her husband, but watching helplessly as his new role seemed to erect invisible barriers between him and her family. The lunch hour brought a brief respite, and Charles found himself walking through the palace gardens, a habit he had maintained since childhood. The formal gardens, with their precisely trimmed hedges and carefully planned flower beds, had always provided him with a sense of peace. Today, however, they reminded him of the constraints that now governed every aspect of his life. He thought about his conversation with Camilla the previous evening. She had been arranging flowers in their private sitting room, a simple domestic activity that she had always found soothing. Her movements had been mechanical, lacking the usual contentment that such tasks brought her. When he had asked about her day, she had simply said it had been quiet, but he had sensed there was more she wanted to say. The afternoon brought meetings with various ministers and advisors, each presenting matters that required the king's consideration. Charles listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and made the necessary decisions, but part of his mind remained focused on the personal challenges that no constitutional expert could help him solve. As evening approached, Charles returned to his study to find another letter waiting on his desk. This one bore the Parker Bowles family crest, and his heart sank as he recognized Tom's handwriting. The letter was polite, formal, and devastating in its restraint. Tom was writing to express his family's gratitude for all the kindness they had received over the years, but also to suggest that perhaps it was time for them to step back and allow the king and queen to focus on their official duties without the complications of extended family obligations. The letter was everything Charles had feared. Written with care and obvious affection, it nevertheless represented a withdrawal that would break Camilla's heart. Tom had clearly discussed this decision with Laura, and probably with their respective spouses as well. They were choosing to protect themselves and their children from the increasing formality that royal life demanded, but in doing so, they were sacrificing the family bonds that had meant so much to all of them. Charles set the letter aside and walked to the window again. The palace grounds were now shrouded in twilight, and lights were beginning to twinkle in the windows of the surrounding buildings. London stretched out before him, millions of people going about their evening routines, most of them blissfully unaware of the personal struggles of their monarch. He thought about the choices he had made throughout his life, the sacrifices that duty had demanded, and the prices that others had paid for his position. His own children had grown up understanding that their father belonged as much to the nation as he did to them. Now, it seemed, history was repeating itself with Camilla's family, despite all his efforts to create a different kind of royal household. The weight of tradition pressed down on him as Charles contemplated the evening ahead. There would be state papers to review, official correspondence to answer, and preparations for the following day's engagements to finalize. The endless cycle of royal duty would continue, just as it had for centuries before him, and just as it would for centuries after he was gone. But tonight, for the first time since becoming king, Charles wondered if the crown was worth the cost it was extracting from the people he loved most. The palace that had been his home for so many years suddenly felt like a beautiful prison, its walls magnificent but impermeable, separating him from the simple human connections that made life meaningful. As darkness settled over London, King Charles III faced a choice that would define not just his reign, but the very nature of what it meant to be both a monarch and a family man in the modern world. The following morning brought an unusual sight in the royal household. Queen Camilla sat alone at the breakfast table in their private dining room, something that hadn't happened since the early days of their marriage. Charles had left for an early meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, leaving behind only a brief note explaining that constitutional matters required his immediate attention. The silver tea service gleamed in the morning sunlight, but the elaborate table setting seemed excessive for one person. Camilla picked up the newspaper, scanning the headlines with practiced efficiency. The royal correspondent for the Times had written another piece about the king's impressive start to his reign, praising his dedication to duty and his seamless transition into the role. Reading about her husband's public success, while contemplating the private cost, made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Lady Sarah Henderson, Camilla's lady-in-waiting and closest confidant, entered the room with a gentle knock. Sarah had been with the royal household for over 2 decades and possessed the rare ability to sense when something was amiss without needing to be told. She had watched Camilla navigate the complexities of royal life with grace and determination, but had never seen her looking quite so isolated. The two women had developed a friendship that transcended their professional relationship over the years. Sarah had been present during some of Camilla's most challenging moments, including the difficult period when public opinion about her relationship with Charles had been particularly harsh. She had also witnessed the joy that Camilla's children and grandchildren brought to her life, watching as family gatherings transformed the usually formal royal residences into homes filled with laughter and warmth. Camilla looked up from her newspaper and managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked Sarah to join her for coffee, a request that indicated she needed conversation more than formal assistance. As Sarah poured herself a cup from the silver service, Camilla began to speak about the changes she had been observing in her family relationships. The conversation revealed the depth of Camilla's concern about the growing distance between Charles and her children. She described recent interactions that had felt stilted and unnatural, so different from the easy camaraderie that had characterized their relationships before the coronation. Tom, who had once called Charles several times a week to discuss everything from current events to cooking techniques, now limited his contact to formal occasions and brief, polite conversations. Laura had become equally distant, despite her natural warmth and her obvious affection for Charles over the years. The woman who had once sought his advice on art acquisitions for her gallery and shared long discussions about history and literature now seemed to carefully limit their interactions to necessary family events. Even more heartbreaking was watching her children, who had once ran to Charles with the same enthusiasm they showed their biological grandparents, now approach him with careful formality. Sarah listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most valuable thing she could offer was simply her attention. She had observed these changes herself, noting how family photographs from recent events showed smiles that seemed more dutiful than genuine. The spontaneous embraces and natural laughter that had once characterized family gatherings had been replaced by careful posture and measured conversations. As Camilla spoke, it became clear that she blamed herself for not addressing the situation sooner. She had hoped that time would allow everyone to adjust to the new dynamics, that the initial awkwardness following the coronation would naturally fade as they all found their footing in this changed landscape. Instead, the distance seemed to be increasing with each passing month. The Queen described her most recent phone conversation with her daughter Laura, during which she had tried to arrange a casual family dinner. Laura had accepted the invitation, but her response had been notably formal, lacking the enthusiasm that such plans had once generated. When Camilla had suggested that they keep things simple and informal, Laura had asked about appropriate dress code and whether there would be any protocol requirements for the children's behavior. These questions, while practically necessary in royal life, highlighted how much their relationship had changed. Laura was no longer asking her mother about family plans. She was consulting with the Queen about royal protocol. The shift was subtle but significant, representing a fundamental change in how Camilla's children now saw their place in her life. Sarah offered gentle observations about the challenges that all royal families faced in maintaining personal relationships while fulfilling public duties. She shared historical examples of similar struggles, reminding Camilla that even Queen Elizabeth II had faced difficulties balancing her roles as monarch and mother. However, both women understood that knowing they weren't alone in facing these challenges didn't make the current situation any less painful. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles, who had returned from his meeting earlier than expected. His entrance changed the dynamic in the room immediately, with Sarah automatically shifting into her more formal professional role and Camilla straightening in her chair. The easy intimacy of their conversation evaporated as royal protocol reasserted itself, even in this private space. Charles appeared tired and slightly overwhelmed, carrying a folder of documents that apparently required Camilla's attention for an upcoming state dinner. As he outlined the various requirements and expectations, Camilla found herself wondering when their private conversations had become dominated by official business. She couldn't remember the last time they had simply talked about their day, their thoughts, or their feelings without the weight of royal responsibility influencing every topic. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Charles had spent his entire adult life preparing for the throne, often at the expense of personal relationships and simple pleasures. Now that he had achieved the position he was born to hold, it seemed to be requiring similar sacrifices from the people around him. The very success he had worked so hard to achieve was creating barriers between him and the family connections that had brought meaning to his life. Later that afternoon, Camilla made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked her private secretary to arrange an informal lunch with her son Tom at a small restaurant in London, away from palace walls and royal protocol. The choice of venue was significant. Rather than inviting Tom to join her at one of the royal residences, she was stepping into his world, signaling her willingness to prioritize their relationship over convenience and tradition. The lunch was scheduled for the following week, but even making the arrangement required extensive security planning and coordination with Tom's schedule. What should have been a simple phone call between mother and son became a formal negotiation involving multiple staff members and detailed logistical considerations. The complexity of arranging such a basic interaction highlighted exactly why their relationship had become so strained. As evening approached, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in their private sitting room for the first time in several days. The space, decorated with personal mementos and family photographs, had always been their refuge from the demands of public life. Tonight, however, even this sanctuary felt touched by the formality that seemed to be invading every aspect of their existence. Camilla decided to share Tom's letter with Charles, watching his face as he read her son's carefully worded withdrawal from regular family contact. She could see the pain in her husband's eyes as he absorbed the implications of Tom's decision. This was exactly what Charles had hoped to avoid when he married Camilla, the repetition of patterns that had characterized royal family relationships for generations. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest they had shared since the coronation. Charles acknowledged that his absorption in royal duties had created distance between him and Camilla's family, but he also expressed frustration about the impossible balance between personal relationships and constitutional obligations. Every moment spent on family matters felt like time stolen from his duties to the nation, yet every moment spent on official business felt like a betrayal of the people he loved. Camilla listened with understanding that came from her own struggles to balance competing demands. She had spent years learning to navigate the expectations placed on royal spouses, often feeling torn between her natural instincts and the requirements of her position. Now she was watching Charles face similar conflicts on an even larger scale, and she could see how the weight of responsibility was affecting his ability to maintain the personal connections that sustained him. They talked about possible solutions, ways to create space for family relationships within the constraints of royal life. But every suggestion seemed to run up against practical limitations or protocol requirements that couldn't be easily dismissed. The system that had sustained the monarchy for centuries was proving remarkably resistant to the kind of flexibility that modern family life required. As they prepared for bed, both Charles and Camilla were aware that their conversation had identified the problem without resolving it. The challenges they faced weren't simply matters of time management or scheduling. They reflected fundamental tensions between institutional requirements and human needs that had confronted royal families throughout history. The palace settled into its evening quiet around them, with staff members completing their final duties before retiring for the night. In just a few hours, the cycle would begin again, bringing new demands and obligations that would claim Charles's attention and energy. But tonight, for a few precious moments, they were simply a husband and wife trying to protect the family they had built together from the forces that threatened to pull it apart. The week that followed brought an unexpected development that would change everything. On Wednesday morning, as Charles was reviewing briefing papers for his upcoming tour of Scotland, an urgent message arrived from Tom Parker Bowles. Unlike his recent formal communications, this was a personal call that carried genuine distress. His daughter, Camilla's granddaughter Lola, had been involved in a riding accident and was being treated at a London hospital. Charles's reaction was immediate and instinctive. Without consulting his private secretary or considering his scheduled appointments, he instructed his driver to take him directly to the hospital. The spontaneous decision sent ripples of confusion through the palace staff, who scrambled to reschedule meetings and manage the security implications of an unplanned royal visit to a public facility. At the hospital, Charles found Tom in the waiting area, his usual composure replaced by the raw anxiety of a worried father. The accident wasn't life-threatening, but Lola had sustained a concussion and broken her arm, requiring several hours of medical attention. When Tom looked up and saw Charles approaching, his carefully maintained distance crumbled completely. For the first time in months, they embraced as family members rather than observing royal protocol. Charles sat with Tom during the long wait, their conversation gradually returning to the natural ease that had characterized their relationship before the coronation. Tom spoke about his daughter's passion for writing, her academic achievements, and her hopes for the future. Charles listened with genuine interest, asking the kind of detailed questions that showed he remembered and cared about Lola's life beyond formal family gatherings. When Laura arrived at the hospital with her husband, she found Charles and Tom deep in conversation about everything from cooking techniques to current political developments. The sight of her stepfather simply being present during a family crisis, without ceremony or official purpose, reminded her powerfully of why she had grown to love him in the first place. His presence wasn't announced in court circulars or photographed for newspapers. He was simply there when her family needed him. The hours spent in that hospital waiting room created a crack in the wall of formality that had been building between them. As they waited for news about Lola's condition, the three adults found themselves talking about memories from happier times, sharing concerns about the children's futures, and rediscovering the common ground that had originally brought them together as a family. Charles made several phone calls to reschedule his appointments, each conversation requiring explanations about why the king's presence was needed at a London hospital. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, initially expressed concern about the security implications and the disruption to the day's schedule, but Charles made it clear that his family's needs took precedence over protocol considerations. The decision marked the first time since his coronation that he had prioritized personal relationships over royal duties. When Lola finally emerged from treatment, groggy but smiling, she was genuinely delighted to see Charles waiting with her father and aunt. Despite her medication and discomfort, she launched into an animated description of the accident, explaining how her horse had been spooked by a sudden noise during their training session. Charles listened with the patient attention of someone who understood both horses and young people, offering gentle reassurance and practical advice about recovery. The scene at the hospital provided a stark contrast to their recent formal interactions. Here was Charles as grandfather figure and family friend, roles that came naturally to him but had been increasingly constrained by royal protocol. Watching him help Lola into the car and coordinate her comfortable transport home, Tom and Laura were reminded of countless similar moments when Charles had simply been part of their extended family. The drive back to Tom's house became an impromptu family gathering. Charles accepted Tom's invitation to stay for dinner, despite the security complications and scheduling disruptions this would create. The meal was simple, prepared from whatever ingredients Tom had available, but it carried emotional weight that no state banquet could match. For the first time in months, they were eating together as family members rather than fulfilling social obligations. During dinner, 9-year-old Freddie, Laura's youngest son, approached Charles with a school project about kings and queens throughout British history. Instead of the careful formality that had characterized their recent interactions, Freddie peppered Charles with direct questions about what it felt like to wear a crown, whether he really lived in a castle, and why grown-ups had to bow to him. Charles answered each question with patience and humor, clearly enjoying the opportunity to connect with his step-grandson without the usual ceremonial constraints. The evening extended far beyond what anyone had planned, with conversation flowing naturally between topics both serious and lighthearted. Charles found himself genuinely relaxed for the first time in weeks, reminded of how much he had missed these easy family interactions. Tom shared stories from his restaurant work, Laura discussed her latest art acquisitions, and the children contributed their own perspectives on everything from school subjects to their favorite television programs. As the evening wound down, Charles faced a choice that would have seemed simple in his previous life, but carried enormous implications now. Tom and Laura had invited him to stay until Lola felt better, suggesting he could easily spend the night in their guest room rather than returning to the palace. The offer was made casually, the way family members naturally extend hospitality to each other, but accepting it would require extensive security arrangements and would further disrupt the next day's royal schedule. Charles's decision to stay surprised everyone, including the palace staff who had to quickly coordinate overnight security and reschedule morning appointments. For the first time since becoming king, he was choosing to sleep somewhere other than royal residences simply because his family needed him present. The precedent was unprecedented in recent royal history, but it felt completely natural to everyone involved. The next morning brought a different perspective on royal life. Charles woke up in a normal family home, checked on Lola's recovery over breakfast, and helped Freddie with his history homework before the security detail arrived to escort him back to official duties. The contrast between this domestic normalcy and the formal grandeur of palace life couldn't have been more stark. During the drive back to Buckingham Palace, Charles had time to reflect on how dramatically one day had changed his understanding of what was possible within his royal role. The crisis had stripped away the accumulated formality that had been building between him and Camilla's family, revealing that their fundamental affection for each other remained intact beneath the protocol and distance. Sir Clive Alderton was waiting with a revised schedule that accommodated the previous day's disruptions, but his expression showed clear concern about the precedent that had been set. The conversation that followed was tactful but direct, with the private secretary expressing worry about how such spontaneous departures from protocol might be perceived by other royal family members, government officials, and the general public. Charles listened to these concerns with understanding, recognizing the valid institutional worries behind them. However, he also made clear that his family relationships were not negotiable aspects of his royal role. The balance between duty and personal life would require ongoing navigation, but the previous day had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for regardless of protocol considerations. When Camilla heard the full story of the hospital visit and overnight stay, her relief was immediately apparent. She had spent the previous evening at an official reception, fulfilling her own royal duties while worrying about both her granddaughter's condition and Charles's absence from his scheduled appointments. Learning that he had simply chosen to be present for their family during a difficult time brought tears to her eyes. The phone calls that came throughout the day told the story of how the royal household was adapting to this unexpected development. Tom called to thank Charles again and to report that Lola was feeling much better. Laura sent a text message that included photos of Freddie proudly showing his completed history project to his classmates, with particular emphasis on his interview with a real king. But perhaps the most significant call came from Tom's ex-wife Sarah, who was also Lola's mother. Despite their divorce years earlier, Sarah had always maintained warm relationships with Camilla's extended family. Her call was brief but emotional, expressing gratitude for Charles's presence during the crisis and noting how much it had meant to see him prioritize family needs over official obligations. These communications represented something more than simple thanks for hospital visits and overnight stays. They indicated a recognition that Charles had made a choice about what kind of king he wanted to be and what kind of family relationships he was willing to fight to preserve. The decision would have implications far beyond one day's disrupted schedule. As evening approached, Charles found himself looking forward to dinner with Camilla in a way he hadn't for weeks. They had much to discuss about the precedent that had been set, the palace reactions that would need to be managed, and the ongoing challenge of balancing royal duties with family relationships. But, for the first time since his coronation, these felt like problems worth solving rather than impossible conflicts to endure. The ripple effects of Charles's spontaneous hospital visit continued throughout the following week, but they weren't all positive. The decision to abandon his scheduled appointments and spend an unplanned night away from royal residences had created tension within the palace hierarchy that couldn't be easily dismissed. Senior courtiers who had spent decades maintaining royal protocol viewed the precedent with considerable alarm. Sir Clive Alderton requested a private meeting with Charles to discuss what he diplomatically termed the delicate balance between personal and constitutional obligations. The conversation took place in the king's study, the same room where Charles had first read Camilla's letter about her family's growing distance. Now, barely 2 weeks later, they were addressing the consequences of his decision to prioritize those family relationships over institutional expectations. The private secretary's concerns were presented with careful respect, but unmistakable urgency. Several government ministers had expressed confusion about the king's absence from scheduled briefings. The Lord Chamberlain had received inquiries from other members of the royal family about whether new protocols were being established for emergency situations. Most significantly, the press had begun asking questions about the king's whereabouts during the unaccounted hours, requiring palace communications staff to provide explanations they hadn't been prepared to give. Charles listened to these concerns while studying the family photographs on his desk, images that captured happier moments when royal protocol hadn't seemed to conflict so directly with personal relationships. He understood the institutional perspective that Sir Clive represented, recognizing the legitimate need for predictability and consistency in royal operations. However, he also understood that something fundamental had shifted in his priorities during those hours at the hospital. The conversation revealed deeper tensions within the royal household about the direction of Charles's reign. Some senior staff members had hoped that his coronation would bring increased formality and traditional structure to royal operations, a return to what they viewed as proper constitutional practice. Others supported his desire to modernize the monarchy and make it more responsive to contemporary family values. The hospital incident had crystallized these competing visions in an unavoidable way. Charles's response was measured but firm. He acknowledged the importance of institutional stability while making clear that his family relationships weren't optional aspects of his identity that could be set aside for royal convenience. The challenge, as he saw it, was finding ways to honor both his constitutional responsibilities and his personal commitments without compromising either unnecessarily. The practical implications of this position became apparent immediately. The royal calendar would need to be restructured to accommodate the possibility of family emergencies. Security protocols would require adjustment to handle spontaneous visits to non-royal locations. Most challenging of all, the palace communication strategy would need to develop explanations for a king who sometimes acted like a grandfather first and a monarch second. Meanwhile, Camilla was facing her own challenges as news of Charles's hospital visit spread through their social circle. Several prominent society figures who had carefully cultivated relationships with the royal couple expressed surprise about the king's spontaneous departure from protocol. While most comments were supportive, the underlying message was clear. Even royal family life was subject to public scrutiny and social judgment. Lady Sarah Henderson observed these reactions with growing concern. As someone who had witnessed decades of royal family struggles to balance public and private life, she recognized the signs of a developing crisis. The challenge wasn't simply about managing one hospital visit, but about establishing sustainable patterns for family relationships that could survive the pressures of royal life over the long term. The situation became more complicated when other royal family members began requesting similar flexibility for their own family obligations. Prince William's office inquired about precedents for canceling official engagements to attend children's school events. Princess and staff asked about protocols for agricultural emergencies at Gackham Park. The hospital visit had inadvertently opened questions about what constituted appropriate reasons for royal schedule changes. Charles found himself in the unusual position of defending decisions that felt completely natural to him, but appeared revolutionary to others. During a private lunch with his sister Princess, she expressed both support for his family priorities and concern about the precedent being established, and had spent her own royal career carefully balancing public duties with personal interests, and she worried about the sustainability of Charles's more flexible approach. The conversation with and revealed family dynamics that extended beyond Charles's immediate household. His decision to prioritize Camilla's family crisis had implications for how all royal family members managed their own relationships. If the king could abandon scheduled appointments for family emergencies, what prevented other royals from making similar choices? The question highlighted tensions between individual autonomy and collective responsibility that had long simmered beneath the surface of royal life. Princess Anne's perspective was particularly valuable because of her reputation for unwavering dedication to royal duty. Her concerns weren't based on disapproval of Charles's family priorities, but on practical worry about maintaining institutional effectiveness. She had seen firsthand how royal family scandals and conflicts could undermine public confidence in the monarchy, and she feared that too much flexibility might create chaos rather than modernization. The discussion between the siblings moved beyond immediate protocol questions to deeper issues about the future of the monarchy. Charles shared his vision of a more human and relatable royal family, one that could fulfill constitutional obligations while maintaining genuine personal relationships, and challenged him to consider whether such an approach was sustainable under the intense scrutiny that modern royals faced from both media and public opinion. Their conversation was interrupted by news that would further complicate the situation. A society photographer had captured images of Charles at the hospital and during his evening at Tom's house. While the photos hadn't been published yet, their existence raised immediate questions about privacy, security, and public perception. The spontaneous family visit was about to become a public relations challenge. The palace communications team worked frantically to develop a response strategy. The photographs showed Charles in casual clothes, appearing relaxed and genuinely engaged with Camilla's family members. While the images portrayed him positively as a caring family figure, they also raised questions about why his presence hadn't been announced through official channels and whether the public had a right to know about all royal activities. Sir Clive Alderton convened an emergency meeting to address the photograph situation and its broader implications. The discussion included representatives from the Royal Protection Unit, the Communications Office, and senior household staff. Everyone present understood that the next few days would determine whether Charles's family-first approach would be seen as admirable modernization or problematic abandonment of royal standards. The meeting revealed the complexity of managing royal life in the digital age. Every spontaneous gesture, every departure from protocol, every moment of genuine human emotion could become subject to analysis and debate. The challenge was finding ways to preserve authentic relationships while managing the inevitable scrutiny that accompanied royal status. Charles's response to these pressures would define not only his own reign but the future direction of the British monarchy. The hospital visit had been a single decision made in response to a family crisis, but it had unleashed forces that would require sustained attention and careful navigation. The question was whether the royal system could evolve to accommodate more flexible approaches to duty and family, or whether tradition would ultimately prove stronger than change. As evening fell over Buckingham Palace, Charles and Camilla prepared for what they both knew would be challenging days ahead. The photographs would be published soon, requiring public explanations and potentially criticism from those who believed royals should maintain greater distance from personal involvement. However, they also knew that backing down from family commitments would send its own message about royal priorities and values. The choice they faced wasn't simply about managing one crisis, but about establishing principles that would guide their reign for years to come. The balance between duty and family, between tradition and modernization, between public service and private relationships would be tested repeatedly. Their response to this first major challenge would set precedents that would echo through the remainder of Charles's time as king. The photographs appeared in the Daily Mail on a Saturday morning, spread across 2 pages under the headline, "The King's Choice. Charles puts family first." The images captured Charles in moments that seemed remarkably ordinary, helping Lola into a car, talking animatedly with Tom outside the hospital, and laughing at something Freddie had said during their evening together. For many readers, these glimpses of genuine family interaction provided a refreshing contrast to the formal portraits that typically defined royal coverage. Public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly positive. Social media filled with comments praising Charles for showing that royalty didn't have to mean emotional distance. Parent support groups shared the photos as examples of how important it was to prioritize family during crisis moments. Veterans organizations noted that Charles had demonstrated the kind of leadership that put people before paperwork, drawing parallels to military commanders who understood that caring for their people was essential to effective leadership. The positive response surprised many within the palace hierarchy who had expected criticism for abandoning protocol. Editorial writers praised the king's human touch, with several major newspapers running opinion pieces about modernizing monarchy for contemporary values. International media picked up the story, with royal correspondents in other European countries comparing Charles's approach favorably to more distant royal traditions elsewhere. However, not all reactions were supportive. Constitutional scholars raised questions about the precedent being established, wondering whether royal duties could be effectively managed if personal relationships took priority over scheduled obligations. Some traditionalist commentators expressed concern about the erosion of royal mystique, arguing that monarchs needed to maintain certain distances to preserve institutional dignity. The most significant response came from an unexpected source. Letters began arriving at Buckingham Palace from families across Britain, sharing their own experiences of balancing work responsibilities with family emergencies. Parents wrote about struggles to manage career demands when children needed them. Adult children described difficulties caring for aging parents while meeting professional obligations. The king's visible choice to prioritize family had apparently struck a chord with citizens facing similar conflicts. Charles read many of these letters personally, moved by stories that reminded him how universal these challenges were. A teacher from Manchester wrote about missing a crucial parent-teacher conference because her supervisor wouldn't allow time off for family obligations. A businessman from Edinburgh described the difficulty of being present for his son's sporting events while managing international client demands. A nurse from Cardiff shared her struggle to care for her elderly mother while working hospital shifts. These letters transformed Charles's understanding of what his hospital visit had represented to the public. Rather than simply a royal protocol decision, it had become a symbol of broader social tensions about balancing professional and personal responsibilities. His choice to put family first during a crisis had resonated with citizens who faced similar decisions regularly, but often lacked the power to make them. The correspondence prompted Charles to consider ways his experience could translate into broader social change. Working with policy advisors, he began exploring initiatives that could support better work-life balance for British families. The idea of a royal commission examining family support policies gained momentum, with Charles's personal experience providing authentic foundation for addressing these widespread concerns. Meanwhile, the practical implications of Charles's new approach continued to reshape palace operations. The royal calendar was redesigned with built-in flexibility for family emergencies. Security protocols were updated to accommodate spontaneous visits to family members. Most importantly, communication strategies were developed to explain when and why the king might prioritize personal obligations over official duties. Sir Clive Alderton, initially concerned about protocol disruptions, found himself managing a more complex but arguably more effective royal operation. The key insight was that Charles's authenticity in balancing family and duty actually strengthened public support for the monarchy rather than weakening it. Citizens who saw their king facing the same conflicts they dealt with daily were more likely to view the royal family as relevant and relatable. The changes weren't without challenges. Some foreign dignitaries required education about the new approach to royal scheduling. Government ministers had to adjust to the possibility that royal engagements might occasionally be rescheduled for family reasons. Palace staff members needed training in handling the increased media attention that accompanied Charles's more spontaneous public appearances. However, these adjustments also brought unexpected benefits. The royal household began attracting staff members who were drawn to working for a monarch who valued work-life balance. Government relations improved as ministers saw Charles demonstrating the kind of family-first priorities that many of their constituents valued. International royal visits became more natural and relaxed as Charles's reputation for authentic relationship building preceded him. The most significant change occurred within Charles and Camilla's extended family itself. The hospital incident had broken down barriers that had been building since the coronation, but sustaining those improvements required ongoing effort. Regular family dinners were reinstated, scheduled around royal obligations, but treated as non-negotiable commitments. Children's school events and sporting activities were added to the royal calendar with the same priority given to state functions. Tom Parker Bowles described the transformation in an interview months later, explaining how his stepfather's hospital visit had demonstrated that royal status didn't have to mean emotional unavailability. The gesture had been particularly meaningful because it showed that Charles understood family relationships required presence during difficult times, not just formal occasions and celebrations. Laura Lopez noticed similar changes in how her children related to Charles. Freddie began calling him regularly to share school achievements and discuss his interests, no longer treating conversations with the king as formal interviews. Lola, recovered from her riding accident, resumed her easy relationship with her step-grandfather, seeking his advice about horses and school with the confidence that he would listen and respond as family rather than monarch. These evolving relationships created positive cycles that strengthened family bonds while enhancing Charles's effectiveness as king. The genuine warmth he shared with Camilla's family became evident in public appearances, making royal events feel more authentic and engaging. Citizens who observed royal family interactions saw evidence of the same values they tried to practice in their own lives. The transformation had implications beyond immediate family relationships. Charles began approaching all his royal interactions with greater authenticity, bringing the same genuine interest he showed Camilla's family to his meetings with citizens, government officials, and foreign dignitaries. The result was a reign characterized by personal engagement rather than ceremonial distance. 6 months after the hospital visit, Charles reflected on how a single day had reshaped his understanding of royal duty. The choice to prioritize family during a crisis hadn't weakened his constitutional effectiveness. Instead, It had strengthened his connection with citizens who faced similar challenges daily. By demonstrating that kings could be grandfathers first when circumstances demanded it, he had made the monarchy more relevant to contemporary British life. The lesson extended beyond royal family dynamics to broader questions about leadership and authenticity. Charles had discovered that effectiveness often required the courage to break with established patterns when they conflicted with fundamental values. His willingness to prioritize family relationships had created space for a more human approach to monarchy without abandoning constitutional responsibilities. As Charles and Camilla looked toward the future, they understood that balancing royal duties with family relationships would remain an ongoing challenge. However, the hospital incident had established that such balance was possible when priorities were clear and when institutional flexibility could accommodate human needs. The king who had once ignored his wife's family concerns had learned that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight challenged centuries of royal tradition. The palace that had once felt like a beautiful prison became a home where family relationships could flourish alongside constitutional duties. The change hadn't been easy, and it required constant navigation of competing demands, but it had proven that monarchy could evolve to embrace both duty and love, both tradition and authenticity, both service to the nation and commitment to family.